I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
Good evening. I'm Howard Husock, Vice President for Policy Research here at the Manhattan Institute and Director of the Institute's Social Entrepreneurship Initiative. It's my honor and pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Clayton Christensen, who will deliver our 5th annual William E. Simon Lecture on Philanthropy and Social Entrepreneurship, entitled Disruptive Technology and the Nonprofit Sector. The Simon Lecture is the second of 2 major annual events which our social entrepreneurship program conducts. In November, we presented our William E. Simon Lifetime Achievement Prize in Social Entrepreneurship this year to Jeffrey Canada of the Harlem Children's Zone. Let me take this opportunity to recognize a past Simon Prize winner, Dan Biederman, the founder of the Bryant Park Restoration Corporation, who's here with us tonight. And in November, we also presented our annual Richard Cornell Awards to 5 up-and-coming social entrepreneurs from nonprofit organizations across the United States. A full description of the program and information about past Simon lecturers, including David Nassau of the City University of New York, Thomas Tierney, the founder of Bridgespan Corporation, and the Institute's own Heather McDonald, can be found in the materials outside. In his path-breaking bestseller, The Innovators Dilemma, this year's Simon lecturer, Clayton Christensen, wrote in a strikingly original way of the reasons for what he called the failure of companies to stay atop their industries when they confront certain types of market and technological change. Since its publication in 1997, Dr. Christensen's analysis of the dynamics of change has continued to describe the American and indeed the world economy, even as he has gone on to apply his insights on innovation, its uses, its importance, its challenges, and its enemies, to a stunning series of subjects. They include healthcare, about which he observed in The Innovator's Prescription that, quote, hoping that our hospitals and doctors will become cheap won't make healthcare affordable and accessible, but a move toward lower-cost venues and lower-cost caregivers will. In his latest book, The Innovative University, he's taken on higher education, about which he has observed bluntly, and I might add courageously, given his own position at the Harvard Business School, that, quote, the business model that has characterized American higher education is at, or even past, its breaking point. Many institutions are increasingly beset by financial difficulties, and the meltdown since 2008 is but a shadow of what is to come. In other words, the willingness and capacity of our speaker tonight to apply broad and cross-cutting insights to sector after sector of our economy and culture is matched by few contemporary commentators. And did I mention that in Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, Mr. Jobs credited as an inspiration Clayton Christensen. We have asked him to build this evening on his insights about disruptive innovation as applied to such nonprofit institutions as universities and hospitals, and to consider America's nonprofit and philanthropic sector broadly. It's worth pointing out that these sectors are not minor parts of our economy. In 2010, for instance, nonprofit institutions contributed $779 billion, or 5.4%, to the nation's GDP, and accounted for 9% of all wage income. Charitable giving was also substantial, totaling $290 billion. And in 2009, nonprofits reported revenues of $1.87 trillion and held assets of $4.3 trillion. These are all figures, moreover, which fundamentally distinguish the United States from other industrialized nations. Our foundations, philanthropists, and nonprofit institutions and social entrepreneurs whom they support, insulated from the forces of disruptive innovation, which Dr. Christensen has identified and chronicled? If not, why not? And how should those of us who care about these uniquely American institutions consider the forces which may be about to buffet them? There is no one better able than our speaker tonight to address such concerns. And I might add, he's eager for your questions from this diverse audience. A native of Salt Lake City, Utah, Clayton Christensen graduated with the highest honors from Brigham Young University. He received a master's degree in applied econometrics and the economics of less developed countries from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar, and an MBA with high distinction from the Harvard Business School. He served as a White House Fellow, and in 1992 was awarded the Doctorate in Business Administration from Harvard Business School. Prior to his present career in academia, he served as chairman and president of Ceramics Process Systems Corporation, the firm he co-founded, and as a staff member at the Boston Consulting Group. He serves on numerous boards of directors and has advised companies and countries around the world. In addition, he's been an elected official in his hometown of Belmont, Massachusetts, where he has also served as a scoutmaster for Boy Scouts of America, Troop 304. Dr. Christensen holds the Kim B. Clark Chair in Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Please join me in welcoming the 2011 Simon Lecturer, Clayton Christensen.
That was very gracious, Howard. Thanks so much. I'm grateful that you'd take the time to listen to me. I hope I can get through my thinking so that I can listen to you instead. Just one other thing about me that you should know. About a year ago, I had a stroke, and a clot came from somewhere and lodged itself right in there and killed about a third of that side of my brain, and unfortunately in that spot is where you formulate speech and writing. And so I went from being at least literate to where I just couldn't say anything. And so we went to Logan Airport, bought a copy of Rosetta Stone for English. And my oldest granddaughter, who was 6, we started level 1, lesson 1. And she just beat the pants off me as I've had to essentially learn how to speak again, word by word. And so you'll see me catch, I can't think of the word. And if you know the word that I'm trying to say, if you just let me know, I think we'd be all better off. And then you'll see me do something unnerving a little bit, and that is I will speak to the floor, not to you. And the reason is that if I look at you, you distract me from my search for the word. Whereas if I only look at the floor, it's a little bit easier. And so I apologize. I have not become shy all of a sudden, but that's just a technique that I've used, so I apologize for that. I've never given this talk before, and so I don't know if it's going to be useful to you. But I have been thinking about all of these things, and am grateful that Howard gave me this opportunity to try to put it all together. For those of you who haven't been exposed to this theory of disruption that emerged from my early research, let me explain what it is. Because it was really written in the context of my observation that almost every company which at one point was widely regarded as unassailably successful, a decade or two later you find them in the middle of the pack or often at the bottom of the heap. And we reached the strangest conclusion, and that is that the causal mechanism behind this was that the managers made all the right decisions, and it was the pursuit of profit that caused the leaders of the industries to fail. In other words, if you do everything right, you're doomed. And I'll illustrate that by the interaction between Toyota and General Motors. Because what we found in our research is that never is it somebody coming into an industry and trying to make a better product that they could sell for better profits to their best customers. That never kills the leaders. It's when somebody comes in at the bottom of the market with a simple product that's not as good as what the leaders are making, but it takes root in an undemanding application at the bottom of a market and then moves up. That's what kills them. So those of you who have a bit of gray hair will remember that during the 1960s, when Toyota attacked the American automobile industry, they did not come in with Lexuses. But do you remember they came in with a rusty little subcompact called Coronas? But they made it so affordable and simple that a whole new population of people could have a new car. And General Motors and Ford were making big cars for big people. Well, Toyota then came down from the bottom and they introduced in sequence Corona, Tercel, Corolla, Camry, Avalon, 4Runner, Sequoia, and then a Lexus. And General Motors and Ford would look at Toyota coming down at the bottom, and occasionally they'd say, you know, we ought to go get those buggers. And they'd send down a Chevette or a Pinto. But then they would compare the profitability of these little subcompacts with the profitability of making even bigger cars for bigger people. It just didn't make sense to defend the least profitable part of the business, because they actually, if they gave the low end to Toyota and added up the remaining numbers, their profitability improved as they got out. And then Toyota, when they make the next bigger and better car, General Motors would look at that and compare that with making even bigger cars for even bigger people, and it made no sense. And so as they lopped off the low end and added up the remaining numbers, their profitability improved as they got out. And as Toyota got in, their profits improved. And they just happened to do this from the bottom to the top of the market until Toyota find themselves making, the best in the world. And who's killing Toyota, incidentally? Toyota doesn't feel like they're being killed. Yeah, Hyundai and Kia, the Koreans, have taken the bottom of the market, not because Toyota's asleep at the switch, but why would they ever invest to defend the least profitable part of the business when they have the privilege of competing against Mercedes, where the margins are attractive? And then the next one is Chery coming from China. And seriously, we don't need to worry about them, do we? So I hope you get a sense for why this happens. And it turns out that these factors are at work in every industry, in every company, and even in competition across nations. Because what creates the energy for Toyota, for Japan to mount the transformation of their nation was in industry after industry. They came in at the bottom of the market and then went up. And Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore and Hong Kong started at the bottom, went up, and now China and India are doing the same. And nations that are languishing in poverty, in many ways, are languishing because they have not yet had entrepreneurs that could do this. So how does this apply to philanthropy and higher education? One of my students, and if your purpose is to develop better theories, then what you have to steel yourself with is the willingness when students say, Clay, I found what's wrong with your theory. Because if you can only explain or point out what the theory doesn't explain, that gives you the opportunity to improve the theory. So my students have a free license anytime to say, Clay, it can't explain this. So one of them, about 5 years ago, pointed out, Clay, your theory can't explain hotels. And I hadn't thought about that before, but it was true. Holiday Inn came in at the bottom of the market, and for reasons we could understand, the higher price hotels didn't go down to compete against Holiday Inn, but Holiday Inn couldn't go up. If they wanted to go up, they had to replicate the cost structure of the nicer hotels. So if they wanted to go up, they had to hire a concierge, just like Four Seasons has a concierge. They couldn't disrupt them by bringing a lower cost business model to higher points in the marketplace. And so it taught us that this mechanism of disruption doesn't necessarily apply everywhere, but there's got to be some kind of a technological core in its product or in its business model that allowed you to start at the bottom and then extend it tier by tier to the top. And so then I thought about higher education and realized that it was in the same boat as Holiday Inn, in that there wasn't anything about a university that had a technological core. So as a new university would start offering simple offerings, like a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree, the minute they do that, of course, they want to get on the Carnegie ladder and become a bigger and better university. But we observed that in order to do that, they didn't disrupt the existing universities. They had to replicate them. And enormous amounts of money were employed, those farther down the Carnegie ladder, trying to emulate those up, is they just have to replicate. And it became very costly to get a degree at a university of higher learning. And then we realized, Clay, in the past, disruption wasn't at work in higher ed, but in the future, online learning brings to higher ed this technological core that is extendable up market. And so it can take root in simple applications, meaning students that couldn't get into a normal university because they're already working and they already have kids, and your ability to reach more and more sophisticated customers with more and more sophisticated content allows them to move up market. And so the theory says that the future is going to be really quite different than the past. So I hope that that is useful to you, to where I'm coming from with this theory of disruption that emerged from our work. In many ways, what kills you if you're a for-profit company is your product becomes irrelevant. And so disruption occurred over and over again in the computing industry. Those of you with gray hair will remember the mainframe computers, and then the mini computers, and then the personal computers, and then the laptop, and now the smartphones. And when the existing companies got killed, like, for example, in Silicon Valley, Sun Microsystems and Silicon Graphics, through the 1990s, made the best computers in the world. And it was just inconceivable to them that they might become irrelevant. And so year after year, they invested a lot of money to make ever more powerful computers. And down at the bottom, here come Apple and Dell with computers that weren't nearly as good as what these guys were making, but getting better. And then within just a couple of years, the floor just disappeared underneath Silicon Graphics and Sun Microsystems, and they just disappeared. And what had been inconceivable, that people wouldn't want more powerful computers, were caught by that they had been asking the wrong question. It's not, do they want the best computers? It is, are there computers that are good enough for the problems that we face? And so Dell and Apple just blew them out of the water. And what happened was their products just became irrelevant to customers in that market. So I think that's the way I frame, is it possible that philanthropic organizations, universities, churches can become disrupted, defined by, is it possible that they will become irrelevant? And I think the answer is resoundingly yes. For example, I'm a very religious man, but I look at many churches in the world who are becoming really quite irrelevant to what the problems that mankind are facing. And inside of a church, if you're inside the church and you're committed to the church, you look at the catechism and the tenets that everybody inside the church believes, and it just is inconceivable to you that some of these things might be wrong. People on the outside can knock on the window and say, yo, that just doesn't make any sense at all, you know. And so there's a consensus inside of a church about what is truth, and everybody believes it from that perspective. Well, there are a lot of churches that are emerging in the world that have the same phenomena, in that the people inside the church can't conceive that the doctrines that they created for themselves might be wrong. So a couple of them. There is a new church in America that was founded somewhere in the late 60s, early 70s, that's called the New Church of Finance. And the members of this church are professors of finance at business schools like Harvard. They run funds, equity funds, hedge funds, venture capital funds. And they got together and said, why don't we define profit for our purposes? And so they have, their catechism includes profit is all defined by ratios in this church. So return on net assets is a ratio. Earnings per share is a ratio. IRR, internal rate of return, is a ratio. And I could go on and on. And the nice thing about defining their the catechism by ratios is you can compare dissimilar things. So I can invest in underwater drilling for oil, and somebody else can invest for electric cars. And if you put their returns on a ratio, you can compare the two, even though they're just totally different. And when you, it's just like for all of us, when they define the pattern or the metric by which our performance will be evaluated, we all try to optimize whatever that measure is. And so when we say to America, no child left behind, bing, the students just lined up around teaching to the right test. And so these guys then, from the Church of Finance, send their missionaries around the world as assistant professors, and preach this truth. So how do you, RONA, for example, return on net assets, how do I get it up? Well, yeah, we could add to the numerator, which is profit, but that takes a long time. On the other hand, the denominator is assets. Why don't we just get the assets off the balance sheet by outsourcing? And the more we outsource, the lower the ratio, the assets, the higher this ratio goes. And America has essentially outsourced most of the work in America. And I just kind of standing outside of that church, increasingly knock on the window and say, ladies and gentlemen, these things are not true. And in many ways, the whole economy is in trouble because you outsource and then return on, or IRR, internal rate of return, causes you, in order to get the ratio up, only invest in very short-term gains. It makes it very hard to invest for the long term. And that is a church that right now is very salient to many people. I suspect 10 years from now, they will be shown for what they are, and that the doctrine of that church will become irrelevant. And so some of you represent philanthropic organizations. I'd like to just think through with you whether it's not the issue of will you go out of business, but rather will you become irrelevant given where the world is going? And will universities, not all universities, become irrelevant, but some of the best today, is it conceivable that the offering that they're giving might become irrelevant? So I want to assert, and I don't know that this is true, but I think it is, that the causal mechanism, fundamental causal mechanism that causes an institution to become irrelevant is data. And the problem with data is that for whatever reason, when God created the world, he only made data available about the past. And we have a big problem at the Harvard Business School because, as you know, we teach by the case method. And in our training, we're taught that if a poor student ever asserts something in the discussion about the case, and they cannot support that up with evidence and data in the case, we're supposed to nail the student to the wall. And I started to do that. And many professors do. And in the process of elevating the virtues of data and facts and analytical decision making, the problem with thinking it that way is we teach our students to make decisions after the game is over, because that is only the point that they know what to do when it has already happened. And we do that in our research. Most of the faculty do their research, and lots of philanthropic organizations and policy wonks and policy groups are driven by data. And some problems with it are it's only available about the past, so it's relevant to the future only if the future is the same as the past. It doesn't have meaning unless you have a theory that gives meaning to data. So, for example, as I described the problem of disruption, the leaders just keep lopping off the lowest remaining products in their product line, and as they cut that off and move up market, their gross margins improve as they get out of business. So if you were running Sun Microsystems, for example, quarter after quarter, you have higher and higher gross margin percentages. And you look at that, how do you know whether that data is good news for Sun Microsystems or bad news? How can you tell? And the only way you can tell is if you have a theory that gives meaning to the data. Or somebody comes up with data from a study that on average chartered schools do better than district schools. And you look at that and say, does this mean anything? And then somebody on the other side comes up with data that shows no, the chartered schools don't do as well. And so whose data do you follow, you know? You cannot, there is no meaning to data unless you can, there's a theory through which you can interpret the data. The way the model in business schools works generally is they're all driven by trying to find the best practices or the best way of doing things. And so they'll get data and find ones in how well all of these actors performed on some metric. And then they'll get data on lots of characteristics about all of these people, and then you push regress on your computer, and out comes this equation, and it shows which characteristics were associated with which outcomes. And so you then find the ones that did the best, list them here. These are all of their characteristics. And then the ones that screwed up are here, and these all have those characteristics, and then you publish a paper with a 95-degree confidence that on average, if you do these things, you'll do better than if you have these characteristics. And this is how you get tenure and so on. But what do you do with this study? Because it might address a population, but it doesn't address an individual entity. And then if somebody comes up with oh, wait a minute, this company's very successful. They don't have any of these characteristics. What do I do? And basically you have to get off the treadmill and let another assistant professor get on the treadmill and regress some other characteristics about some other outcome and do it forever and ever. In education, data, researchers, policy people in education are slaves to data, because I can't decisively implement a new way of doing things unless there's data that shows that this is better than that. But you don't have data because nobody has done this. But you can't get data to do it because there's no data. And so we have caught the enterprise meaning people who are trying to improve education and healthcare, by this slavery to data. So if you've got to make decisions about the future, or you've got money and you want to invest for the future and there's no data out there, what are you going to do? Wait forever until data is available about the future? No. Instead, what you need is a theory. And a theory in management gets a bum rap because theory is associated with the word theoretical, which connotes impractical, and people in the private sector are men and women of action, and so they have no time for theory. But in reality, all a theory is a statement of what causes what and why. And when you think of a theory in those terms as a statement of causality, you realize, oh my gosh, as a manager, I am a voracious consumer of theory. Every time I take an action, it's based upon a theory in my mind that if I do this, I'll get the result I need. Or every time I develop a plan, it's predicated upon one or more theories that if I do these, we'll get the result. Most of us are not aware when we are using theories, but whenever we analyze data, we're using a theory. And but we're not aware of it. And so I want to assert to you as kind of the next thing I hope you will walk away with to think about is that data theory is a way that you can see the future with more clarity than data. Let me, to frame the value of a theory, I'll give you 3 theories that are relative to aviation. One is the theory of gravity, which Newton brought to us, that says stuff goes down. Another theory, Daniel Bernoulli gave us a theory that says, yeah, but if you have this shape called an airfoil and you run air past it, it causes a push-up called Bernoulli's principle. And then there's another one that is empirically derived, that under different circumstances you want to shift the angle of the propeller on a plane to be vertical or horizontal with the wind. Which of those 3 pieces of understanding is most useful for that enterprise, which is enabling men and women to fly? Any of you vote for the angle on the propeller? None. How many of you think Bernoulli's principle is the most important? About half. How many of you think that gravity is the most important? It's hard to vote, isn't it? But in reality, if you didn't have the definition of the problem, there was no way that you could develop a solution. And if someone defines a problem for which there is no solution, at least it defines the agenda of researchers to figure out how to address that problem. And I think that in many ways, what a theory creates is a common basis of understanding and a common way to frame the problem. So let me give you just a couple of examples from my own research. And then I want to just have you thinking about, if you've got largesse and you want to invest in people to solve problems, do you want to invest in projects that will analyze data to give us the answer? Or is it possible that we will retain our relevance much longer if we invest to develop theories? Again, a theory is a statement of causality. So I got a call one day, 15 years ago, 12 years ago, from Andy Grove, who is the founder of Intel. And he said, I'm a busy man. I have no time to read academic drivel. But somebody told me you have developed a theory whose implication is Intel is going to get killed. And I wonder if you'd just come and meet with me and my staff in a couple of weeks and explain the theory so we know why you're so pessimistic. And I said, well, sure, I'd love to come. For me, it was like a chance of a lifetime. So I go out there, and he's a very gruff man. I walked into the room, and he said, look, stuff's happened to us. We don't have time for you. But we'll give you 10 minutes. Tell us what it means for Intel. And then we got to get on with life. And I said, Dr. Grove, I can't, because I have no opinion about Intel. I know very little about Intel, other than that you're in my machine. But the theory has an opinion, and I need to be able to explain the theory, and then we can talk about Intel. And nobody had ever told him that theories have opinions about him. And so he sat back impatiently, and 10 minutes into my explaining this theory of disruption, he chopped me off and he said, look, I got your stupid theory. Tell me what it means for Intel. And he got what he got, and he really did get it. And I said, I can't yet. I've got to describe how this process of disruption worked its way through a very different industry than yours, just so you can visualize how the theory works. And so I told him how Toyota came in at the bottom of the market. And at this point, they hadn't yet killed General Motors, but you could see it coming. And when I came to the point where I said that they had just announced the Lexus, Grove chopped me off and he said, oh, I get what you're telling it means for Intel. And he said, you look down at the bottom of our market, there are two companies coming up at us just like Toyota. And if we don't want them to get killed, we got to go down to the bottom and launch what they called the Celeron processor. And I thought about this a lot, because if I'd have been suckered into telling Andy Grove what he should do about Intel, he forgets every 5 minutes more than I ever understood about that industry, and data would never convince him. But rather than telling him what to think, I taught him how to think. And it was so compelling that he thought I told him the answer. And I subsequently, whenever somebody asks me a question, I never give them an answer. But I say, can I just give a few minutes to describe the problem and describe what's causing this to happen? And then I say, now let me show how that worked its way through a different industry. And then they say, oh, I get it. So anyway, I had a great, put that on my resume. And then I got a call one day from Secretary Cohen, who was the Secretary of Defense, which was like, oh my gosh. And he said, I've read this book of yours, The Innovators Dilemma. I wonder if you'd just come down and present your research to my staff. And for me, there's a lifetime too, you know, so I said, sure. And when he said my staff, I thought he had in mind a few second lieutenants and college interns. And when I walked into his conference room in the Pentagon, holy cow, on the front row were the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And behind those were the secretaries of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and then were the under and assistant and deputy secretaries. And he just inadvertently said, this is the first time we've ever pulled the whole team together, Clay. So then I thought, man, they are starved for intellectual stimulation. So I just started. And I had a chart on the wall that described how Toyota came from the bottom of the market, went to the top. It was the very same slide that I showed to Andy Grove. And when I was done with that, General Sheldon, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, Clay, you're clueless why we're interested in this, aren't you? And I said, I'm clueless. And he said, well, that top line up there that is Toyota introducing luxury cars. He said, to us, that's the Russians. And the Russians have disappeared as a market. And down here at the bottom, which was the Corona subcompacts, to us, that's terrorism. And there isn't anything about the way we're organized that will make us relevant to what's going at the bottom of the market. And he said, what do I do? And I told him the same answer that I gave Grove, and that is, this organization that you have can't do that. You have to set up a completely different business model to go after the low end of a market. And it turned out that a theory at a fundamental level, because a theory defines the problem and what causes something to happen. For me, terrorism and semiconductors aren't two different subjects, defining it by the problem that they both face And fundamentally, how you solve the problem at a fundamental level is applicable across many industries. Whereas if you study data, the characteristics of the phenomena, these are two fundamentally different kinds of problems. And so what I wanted to suggest to you is that investing in theory maybe will give you a better way to change the world than if you fund projects that people apply for grants from. So let me go back to Andy Grove, something else that he taught me. So he decided they needed to go to the bottom of the market. I was interested to see that he did not then stand up in front of all of the employees and announce, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to the bottom of the microprocessor market, because that was just so counter to the profit logic of Intel. But instead what he did was he set up a seminar, and he brought in 100 people at a time, 20 times over the course of a year, and they lasted a whole day. And he explained the theory, and then they had breakout groups to discuss. Is somebody going to kill Intel? Present a little bit more, have breakout groups to discuss how could we use this theory to kill other companies? And then present a little bit more and have great breakout groups to discuss now how do we need to change how Intel is organized. And so over the course of a year, they took about 2,000 of their employees through this seminar. Last year, Intel shipped about $25 billion of products that emerged from these breakout groups in these seminars. So I had time with him a couple of years ago and asked him how he'd pulled this off, which is really quite remarkable. And he said, you know, your theories, Clay, never give us any answers, but they give us a common language and a common way to frame the problem. So as a group, we could reach consensus around what otherwise would have been a counterintuitive course of action. And I just thought that was brilliant. And as I now, as Howard noticed that we've written a couple of books about why our schools and our both K through 12 and higher ed struggle to improve and why healthcare is so costly and inaccessible. When you go to Washington and listen to what they're talking about when they have meetings about how do we solve these problems, they just talk past each other because they all come to these meetings with self-serving data and self-serving answers, but they don't have a common language and they don't have a common way to frame the problems. And it's like these poor people are sitting at the base of the Tower of Babel. And God, you know, got so mad at them that they changed their language so they couldn't work together or communicate. And that's, I think, at a fundamental level, why Washington is deadlocked on big issues like education and healthcare, is they're going for the answer first and looking for data to give us the answer, when in reality, you need to have a common language and a common way to frame the problem, what causes the problem. And if we had that, then getting the answers would be fairly straightforward. So I just wanted to offer that to those of you who are either accepting resources or giving resources, that maybe our paradigm is just skewed. And we may very much become irrelevant. Be relevant because we're funding things that actually make less and less of an impact on the world. And maybe we'll become more relevant, actually, if we invest research to understand how the world works. So those are just some of my thoughts. I've gone a little bit long, But if you have any questions or cannonballs or criticisms, I'd love to get it. And Howard, do you want to run the...
You stay there. So it's a lot of questions here. Ken Berger from Charity Navigator, who measures performance of those who accept resources, is with us.
Well, this was very interesting. The funny thing is, I kept thinking as you were saying these things that if if theory is more important and data is less important, then the nonprofit sector should be considered the most advanced sector in the United States of America, because a lot of the discussion that's going on right now is arguing that there is an incredible paucity of meaningful data about what's going on, and being able to really measure the results in a meaningful way. There's just so little of it out there. And so many nonprofits have a theory of change, of what they're going to do, but then when you look for the evidence, it's so often not there. So that was sort of, it kept cycling through my mind as to how that would work. I mean, there is data, but a lot of the data is counting activities, counting outputs, but in terms of meaningful change, there's very little in many parts of the nonprofit sector.
Boy, great question, great question. So I would say that collecting data per se is really a wonderful endeavor. Like the Pew folks get data on things. And I think that that's really quite important. To go from data to a theory is hard to do. In almost every case, when somebody figures out what causes something to happen, that it comes from an N of 1. So Daniel Bernoulli didn't do a big regression of those that can fly, those who can't fly, those who have wings, those who don't have wings. He didn't do that. He just had a bird and looked at that thing, an N of 1. And in business, those good theories that describe how the world works almost always come from an N of 1. And then once you have a theory, you can actually bring in data if you want to now start to say, what does the theory, what can it explain? And I think approaching it that way is more consistent with my sense for how you would change the world. That was a great question.
Frank Lichtenberg from Columbia Business School is here.
Whoa. I have written a lot of things about the disruption of the business schools. I never say it about you. I always say it about us, just to be polite.
Well, in the introduction, Howard said you were at one time an econometrician, but it sounds like you're a reformed econometrician. So put simply, it seems that you have, and I tried to put my notes in an email to myself, you kind of dumped on data a little bit and sort of been a strong advocate for theory. Don't you think we need both? I mean, the theory is great, but the problem is some theories are incorrect, like the Lamarck theory of evolution, for example. And so how are we going to tell the correct theories from the incorrect theories? Don't we need data to do that?
Yeah.
Didn't we all learn in elementary school or middle school the scientific method, and that we're going to, that what we start with are hypotheses, and in order for something to become a theory, it has to be validated by data.
Yeah.
And finally, I would say, it seems that you do actually have a general theory which is testable, which is kind of the lowest cost thing. The low cost entrant is going to dominate the industry. And if we say, look at Walmart or something, that would certainly seem to be true, but not invariably. I study healthcare, I study innovation in healthcare, and I would say that in general, the newer, more expensive therapies, they are more expensive, but they're really worth it. They're better, and therefore that the sort of the low-cost product is not necessarily the best product.
Yeah. Some great observations. And I do, I have I've been on both sides of data battles for a long time, and so that's kind of why I'm on the warpath against it. But let me frame it this way. Almost never will data, meaning a big N, give you deep understanding of what causes it to happen. You can get statements of correlation that generalize themselves to populations, but it's very hard to understand the fundamental causal mechanism with the analysis of big N. And so if we want to understand what causes something to happen, it's from an N of 1, almost always. And then you're right, just as we said, you can then bring data in to figure out what doesn't it explain. And as Kuhn taught us, the discovery of an anomaly is critical because that allows you to go back in and improve your statement of causality to accomplish that. I'd say the other thing, though, and this happened to me with the Innovators Dilemma. So, like you, people would read it, and then they'd say, Clay, but does this apply to software? And so I'd do a study and showed, yeah, it applies to software. And then somebody said, but does it apply to education, to healthcare, to fire engines, somebody said, literally. And so I studied all of those. And then somebody said, does it apply to SAP and Oracle? Does it apply to Germany was another question. And then the killer was, Clay, I understand that it applied to the past of the disk drive industry. Does it apply to the future of the disk drive industry? And then I realized that you can't validate a theory by applying it to data and industries over and over again, especially when you want to use the theory to say what's going to happen in the future. And so you could never validate a theory with data. But instead, if I go back to man's attempt to fly, they have some theories, and then they fabricate a machine that flies. And if it was successful, and you came back around and you landed, you didn't learn anything about the theory. But if you crashed, then it allowed you to answer another question, which is, geez, it's not that God canceled Bernoulli's principle on that particular Wednesday, but rather, I wonder what it was about the situation that they found themselves in that caused this mechanism not to result in success. And once they understood the set of circumstances that you find yourself in, then you could say, all right, you as an individual, if you find yourself in this situation, these are the rules that you should follow to fly the plane. But if you find yourself in this situation, don't follow those rules because they don't work. This is how to do it. And if you're in this situation, buddy, don't try because it's impossible. And so you validate a theory if you can define the different situations in which you would find yourself. And that will never be complete. But that's our sense for how you validate a theory.
Whoa, hang on, Frank. I don't think we want to have we'll let you guys take it to the seminar room, though.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I can't resist here on the philanthropy subject. I know there are a lot of donors in the room. There's been a fashion recently in philanthropy to sunset foundations, put them out of business, commit suicide by design because of, I think, in part a phrase that you use, the fear of becoming irrelevant or being hijacked for purposes that were never contemplated. I'd love to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, I worry a lot about that. So, and I think that you're most vulnerable to that if you have somehow been searching for answers Or maybe the people who gave you the money to invest had an answer. And your purpose is to, as missionaries, teach or preach this answer to a problem. And if it becomes that that clearly isn't the answer, or others who have more researchers and resources don't agree with your answer, and they have their answer. That's the kind of battle in which you become you can become irrelevant. If the purpose, and so I think it's right. You know, if that's the way you approach things, and now your answer is lost the race. But on the other hand, if what we're trying to understand is what causes things to happen, I think that kind of a quest is more robust, trying to understand the fundamental problem. And then once you have the problem and everybody understands it, then you put into play lots of people who, on that understanding, are coming up with answers, as opposed to you're telling them what the answer is.
Depends on the foundation. Either what I get out of that. We've got time for just a couple of more. One more, sir.
My name is Larry Bridwell, and I teach MBA students at Pace University. And being here in New York, I have a lot of students from China and India.
Yeah.
And I also worked 10 years with IBM, and I just went to a party Sunday talking to retired IBMers. And in terms of data, in 1990, 3/4 of the employees of IBM were in the United States.
Yes.
It is now less than 1/4. In fact, IBM now has more employees in India than it does in the USA.
Yeah.
So you talk disruption, you talk data, and these two veteran, proud, long-time IBMers said IBM is now an Asian company. It is no longer
that's
an American
remarkable, isn't it?
company. So in terms of your disruptive theory, and of course this relates because we got the Occupy Wall Street, which is where are Americans going to be able to get jobs if IBM is sending its work to India?
Yeah, yeah. Great point. And IBM is a wonderful anomaly that really helped us improve the theory, because they start out with mainframes, and of all of the mainframe companies, only IBM made the next disruptive chip to mini computers, and of all the mini computer companies, IBM was the only one that made it to the personal computer. Everybody else was killed by disruption. And it turned out that the reason why is that they set up a completely different business unit to make these new things. So they made the IBM in Poughkeepsie, the mini computer in Rochester, Minnesota, the PC in Florida. And it was very helpful in improving the theory because, kind of by analogy, individual organisms don't evolve. They're born, they die. But mutants gain market share, and so a population can evolve even though the individuals within it do not. And what we learned from IBM is a business unit actually isn't designed to evolve very well. They're designed to do a particular thing well, but by creating new business units with new business models, the corporation evolved magnificently, but the business units within it did not evolve. They were just shut down one by one. And as a amendment to the theory, boy, I'm glad that it was out there as an anomaly, because it made the theory a lot better.
Please
Great
join me in
question. Thank
thanking
you.
Clayton Christensen.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.